At 7:48 on the morning of the 7th of December 1941, 353 Japanese aircraft descended on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Oahu, Hawaii, in two precisely choreographed waves. Within 90 minutes, the Imperial Japanese Navy had sunk or damaged 18 warships, destroyed 188 aircraft, and killed 2,403 Americans. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's planners had spent 11 months rehearsing the strike, calibrating their especially modified Type 91 aerial torpedoes to run shallow in Pearl Harbor's 12-meter depth, and training their aviators at Kagoshima Bay, whose geography mimicked the target. By any conventional measure of an opening naval blow, it was a masterpiece of operational planning. And yet the moment Yamamoto received word that the attack had succeeded, he is reported to have said, quietly, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Whether he spoke those precise words is disputed by historians, but the sentiment is not. Japan had staked its entire strategic future on the assumption that a single devastating shock would shatter American will, that a democracy grown fat on peacetime comfort would sue for a negotiated settlement rather than face years of costly warfare across the breadth of the Pacific. On paper, it was not an unreasonable gamble. What the Japanese planners failed to calculate was the one variable that would ultimately render every tactical success they ever achieved completely irrelevant: American industrial capacity. Here is the paradox at the heart of the 7th of December. Japan's greatest victory was, in every strategically meaningful sense, her most catastrophic mistake. The attack did not cripple American power, it mobilized it. And the machinery that mobilized was of a scale that the Imperial General Staff, operating from a nation of 73 million people with a steel output of 7.8 million tons per year, had simply never permitted themselves to fully imagine. Standard strategic thinking in 1941, not merely in Tokyo, but among military theorists across Europe, emphasized the power of the decisive opening blow. The concept, rooted in the German Blitzkrieg model and reinforced by Japan's own spectacular opening strike against the Russian fleet at Port Arthur in 1904, held that a sufficiently aggressive initial assault could paralyze an opponent's capacity to respond before he had time to recover his nerve. Critics of American military readiness pointed to the isolationist sentiment that had kept the United States out of the European War, to the 1937 Neutrality Acts, and to the fact that in 1939 the entire United States Army ranked 18th in the world by size, smaller than Romania's. Japanese planners estimated that the Philippines could be seized, the Dutch East Indies oil fields secured, and a defensive perimeter stretching from Burma to the Central Pacific consolidated, all before Washington could effectively react. The Americans, the thinking ran, would negotiate. They always negotiated. Admiral Yamamoto himself understood the structural flaw in this reasoning better than almost anyone else on the Japanese side. He had studied at Harvard between 1919 and 1921, had served as naval attaché in Washington, and had toured American automobile factories in Detroit. He knew in a way his colleagues did not what American industry looked like when it was not yet trying. In the first 6 to 12 months of a war with the United States and Great Britain, he wrote to Navy Minister Koshiro Oikawa in January 1941, "I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But then, if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success." It was, in retrospect, one of the most accurate strategic forecasts of the entire war, and it was completely ignored. The secret was in the numbers, specifically the numbers that describe American manufacturing in the years immediately preceding Pearl Harbor. In 1940, the United States produced 4,710 aircraft. In 1941, that figure rose to 19,133. By 1944, American factories were delivering 96,218 aircraft per year, more than one every 5.5 minutes around the clock every day. Japan, by contrast, produced 28,180 aircraft in her single best year, 1944, and that was with her factories operating under acute material shortages, her merchant fleet being systematically destroyed by American submarines, and her skilled workforce increasingly conscripted into military service. The disparity in shipbuilding was equally staggering. Japan began the war with 10 fleet carriers and constructed 17 more during the conflict. The United States began with 7 fleet carriers, lost 4 in the desperate battles of 1942, and responded by commissioning 151 carriers of various classes by the war's end, including the Essex-class fleet carriers, each displacing 27,000 to 100 tons, carrying 90 aircraft, and built at the rate of 1 every 2 to 3 months at the Newport News and Brooklyn Navy Yards. The Casablanca-class escort carriers, smaller vessels built to protect convoys and support amphibious landings, were completed in as little as 75 days from keel laying to commissioning. The Kaiser shipyards in Oregon and California, which had never built a warship before the war, were producing Liberty cargo ships on a production line so efficient that the average construction time fell from 355 days in 1941 to 42 days by 1943. One ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was famously assembled in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes as a publicity demonstration. What made this possible was not simply the size of the American economy, though its gross domestic product of $1,057 trillion in 1945 dollars dwarfed Japan's $196 billion, but the specific character of American industrial organization. Henry Ford's moving assembly line, the interchangeable parts. Philosophy refined across 2 generations of automobile manufacturing, the deep reservoir of trained engineers and tool and die makers spread across every Midwestern city. All of it was immediately convertible to war production in a way that Japan's more traditional artisanal manufacturing base simply was not. The consequences played out in specific, measurable engagements. At the Battle of Midway, the 4th to 7th of June 1942, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy sank 4 of Japan's 6 frontline fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with a heavy cruiser at a cost of 1 American carrier, USS Yorktown, which had herself been patched together after severe damage at the Battle of the Coral Sea in just 72 hours of round-the-clock repairs at Pearl Harbor's Navy Yard. Japan lost 3,057 men at Midway, including, critically, 110 of her most experienced and irreplaceable carrier aviators, men who had taken years to train, whose skills had been honed over campaigns in China and at Pearl Harbor itself, and who simply could not be replaced at anything approaching the rate they were lost. This was the deeper wound that Pearl Harbor had failed to inflict, and that Midway began to open. Japan had entered the war with perhaps 3,500 frontline naval aviators, all of them highly trained and combat experienced. Her pilot training program, requiring between 700 and 800 flight hours before a man was considered ready for carrier operations, produced perhaps 100 pilots per month under the pre-war system. The United States, by contrast, was training 100,000 pilots per year by 1944, cycling them through a standardized curriculum at bases across Texas, Florida, and California. By the time of the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the engagement American aircrew would nickname the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese carrier air groups were flying aircraft that were, in some cases, technically superior to their American counterparts, crewed by pilots so poorly trained that experienced American flyers found them almost dangerously easy to engage. In a single day's fighting on the 19th of June, American fighter pilots and anti-aircraft gunners destroyed 330 Japanese aircraft for the loss of just 29 of their own. They were coming in so fast and so badly flown that it seemed almost unsporting, recalled Lieutenant Commander Paul By of Fighter Squadron 2 aboard USS Lexington in testimony to the post-battle debrief. We simply could not miss. This wasn't accidental, and the Americans weren't simply fortunate. The mobilization that followed Pearl Harbor was the result of a structural truth about democratic industrial societies that Japan's planners had observed but not truly absorbed. When such societies perceive an existential threat, the psychological and economic energy they can direct toward a single purpose is, in the medium term, essentially unlimited. President Roosevelt's War Production Board, established in January 1942, converted the entire American consumer economy to military output with extraordinary speed. General Motors ceased producing civilian automobiles on the 1st of February 1942 and began producing tanks, aircraft engines, and military trucks. Chrysler's Dodge division manufactured the Bofors 40mm anti-aircraft gun. The Willow Run plant in Michigan, built by Ford specifically to produce the B-24 Liberator heavy bomber, eventually delivered 1 completed aircraft every 63 minutes. Commanders in Tokyo weren't ignorant of American industrial potential. They were gambling that they would not have time to express it. They were right about the timeline and catastrophically wrong about everything that followed from it. The assumption was that the loss of the Pacific Fleet's battleships would delay effective American counter-operations by 18 months to 2 years, by which point Japan's defensive perimeter would be so strongly fortified that the cost of breaching it would be politically unacceptable to an American electorate. What the attack actually accomplished was to destroy 8 battleships, of which 6 were subsequently repaired and returned to service, whilst leaving untouched the fuel storage facilities at Pearl Harbor, 4.5 million barrels of oil, without which the Pacific Fleet would have been operationally paralyzed, the submarine pens, and most fatefully of all, the 3 American aircraft carriers that happened to be at sea on the morning of the attack. USS Enterprise was 215 miles west of Pearl Harbor on a ferry mission to Wake Island. USS Lexington was 460 miles southeast, delivering aircraft to Midway. USS Saratoga was in Puget Sound undergoing refit. Battlefields aren't theoretical constructs, and wars are not won on the balance sheets of opening engagements. Japan struck the United States Navy's past, its battleship fleet, the great gray dreadnoughts of a pre-aviation strategic doctrine, and left its future entirely intact. The carriers, the fuel, the repair infrastructure, the submarine force, and above all the intact, outraged, now united American home front. These were the instruments of Japan's eventual destruction, and every one of them survived the 7th of December 1941 without a scratch. Admiral Yamamoto had understood, perhaps better than any man alive, that Japan could not win a prolonged industrial war against the United States. His solution, the decisive knockout blow, was the only logical strategy available to him. Its failure was not a failure of Japanese courage or of tactical skill or even of strategic imagination. It was a failure of arithmetic, and in the end, arithmetic always wins.